There are exactly 423 words in the official closure notice for Section 12 of Whitepine National Forest. I have read them so many times I can recite them from memory. The document, filed with the Department of Interior on March 14th, lists the reason for closure as ongoing environmental study requiring restricted access for public safety. The closure affects approximately 8 square miles of old-growth forest in northern Idaho, a section of wilderness I have visited every autumn for the past 11 years. The notice does not specify what is being studied. It does not provide a timeline for reopening. It does not mention any ecological disaster, fire risk, or wildlife concern. The language is so deliberately vague that it feels like a form someone filled out while trying very hard not to say anything at all. When I called the ranger station, the woman who answered told me she couldn't provide additional details. When I asked who could, she said she didn't know. When I asked if anyone knew, there was a long pause before she suggested I submit a written request through the regional office. She sounded tired. She sounded like she had answered this question many times already. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I work as an accountant. I file taxes. I arrive at conclusions based on documentation and verifiable information. But I also know when something does not add up. A forest does not simply close without explanation. Not one that has been accessible to the public for over 70 years. Not one with maintained trails and seasonal campsites and a parking lot that gets repaved every other summer. So on a cold Saturday in late October, I parked at the closed gate on Forest Road 18 and started walking. The chain across the road was new. The signs were new. Everything else looked exactly as it always had, which made what I found 3 hours later so much worse, because the forest had not changed. The forest had rearranged itself, and it had done so in ways that should have been impossible. My boots crunched on gravel as I ducked under the chain. The temperature was dropping as afternoon shadows lengthened across the access road. I had brought proper gear: water, emergency supplies, a first aid kit, navigation equipment. I had told no one where I was going. That was probably stupid. But I also did not want to explain why I was trespassing in a closed federal wilderness area because a bureaucratic form letter had failed to satisfy my curiosity. The first mile of the approach road was exactly as I remembered it. Packed dirt surface with scattered gravel, slight upward grade, Douglas firs pressing close on both sides, their lower branches dead and grey from lack of sunlight. The forest floor was the typical northwestern composition: thick moss covering fallen logs, sword ferns clustered in damp hollows, the occasional devil's club with its spiky stems warning hikers to keep their distance. Everything was normal. Everything was familiar. That was what made the shift so disorienting when it finally happened. Chapter 1. A familiar place that feels off. I have walked the Ridgeline Trail 47 times. I know its turns. I know where the incline sharpens near mile marker 2. I know the cluster of white birch trees that grows just before the trail splits toward Crescent Lake. I know the flat boulder shaped like a broken tooth that marks the halfway point. I know this trail the way you know the route to your own mailbox, which is why I noticed immediately when things were wrong. The trailhead started in the right place. The wooden sign marking the route was exactly where it should be, weathered and familiar. The carved letters spelling Ridgeline Trail were worn but legible. The arrow pointing into the forest was correct. But within 20 minutes of hiking, I realised the distances were off. The birch cluster appeared too early. The incline came too late. The boulder was present, but it was on the wrong side of the path. I stopped and checked my phone. No signal, which was normal this far in, but my downloaded GPS map showed my position clearly. I was on the Ridgeline Trail. My coordinates matched perfectly with the trail route I had hiked dozens of times before. According to the satellite data, I was exactly where I should be. But the landscape around me did not match my memory. I have read about missing time in abduction accounts. I have read about spatial disorientation caused by panic or dehydration. But I was neither panicked nor dehydrated. My watch showed the correct time. My water bottle was still half full. My memory was clear. The forest was wrong. I continued walking, paying closer attention now. The trees were the same species: Douglas fir, western red cedar, lodgepole pine. The undergrowth was consistent with the region: salal, Oregon grape, sword fern. The soil was the same volcanic composition. Every individual element was correct, but their arrangement had shifted in ways that were subtle and pervasive. It reminded me of when you rearrange furniture in a room you've lived in for years. Everything is familiar. Nothing is where it used to be, except this was a forest that had stood for centuries, a forest where the positions of trees do not change. The air felt different too, heavier somehow, like the atmospheric pressure had increased slightly, or like I was breathing in a room where too many people had been talking for too long. The oxygen content was fine. I was not lightheaded or struggling, but something about the air itself felt saturated, dense with something I could not identify. Near what should have been mile marker 3, I found the first marking. It was grown into the bark of a large cedar tree, perhaps 200 years old based on its diameter. The pattern was not carved. There were no tool marks, no exposed wood, no signs of human interference. Instead, the bark itself had grown in a spiral formation that created a distinct shape. The ridges and valleys of the bark tissue had organized themselves into something that looked deliberate. The shape was the letter M. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. Bark patterns can be irregular. Wind and weather create stress that affects growth. I knew this, but this was too clean, too geometric. The spiral was too uniform, and when I stepped back to view the tree from a wider angle, I saw that the pattern was only visible from a specific position on the trail. From any other angle, it disappeared into the natural texture of the bark. Someone would have had to plan this decades ago, guiding the tree's growth with intention. But there was no mechanism for that. No wires or constraints in the bark. No evidence of long-term interference. I reached out and touched the formation. The bark was cool under my fingers, rough, completely natural in texture. The ridges where the letter formed were simply places where the bark had grown more aggressively. The valleys were places where growth had been suppressed or inhibited somehow. But by what mechanism? What could cause a tree to grow in alphabetic patterns? I took a photograph and kept walking. My hands were shaking slightly as I lowered my phone. Not from fear exactly, more from the recognition that I had encountered something that did not fit into my understanding of how the world worked, and that recognition was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The next tree showed the letter A, then R, then C, then U. My name is Marcus. The fifth tree, bearing the letter S, was the largest of the group, an ancient cedar with a trunk diameter that would have required 3 people holding hands to encircle. The bark letter was proportionally larger here, perhaps 10 inches tall instead of 8. The spiral formation was more elaborate, with secondary patterns radiating outward from the main letter like decorative flourishes. I photographed each tree carefully, documenting the exact position, the size of the letters, the species of tree, the approximate age based on trunk diameter. I was building evidence. For what purpose, I did not yet know, but my training as an accountant had taught me that documentation was crucial, that patterns only revealed themselves through careful record keeping. The trees were spaced at intervals that felt regular. I paced out the distances, approximately 90 feet between each one. Not exact, but close enough to suggest intention rather than coincidence. Someone or something had planned this sequence, had arranged for these specific trees to grow these specific patterns at these specific locations. But when? The bark formations were not new. They had clearly been developing for years, possibly decades. I had hiked past these exact trees multiple times in previous years. I would have noticed my own name carved into them, unless I had not been looking for it, unless it had only recently become visible, or unless my memory was unreliable in ways I had not considered. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photo archive. I had hundreds of pictures from previous hikes on this trail. I found images from last autumn, then from 2 years ago, then from 3 years ago. I zoomed in on trees in the background, looking for any sign of the bark formations. They were not there. In photographs from 3 years ago, the same trees were visible, but the bark patterns were absent, or at least not prominent enough to be visible in the image resolution I had captured, which meant either the formations had developed very recently, or they had existed but been too subtle to photograph unintentionally. I continued along the trail, watching for more letters. For the next half mile, I found nothing unusual. The forest returned to its normal, familiar wrongness. Trees in slightly incorrect positions, curves in the trail that felt a few degrees off, but no more letters. The silence was becoming noticeable. I had not heard a bird call in at least 15 minutes. No rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. No distant sounds of aircraft or traffic. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and my own breathing. The forest had gone completely quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Then I reached the place where Crescent Lake should have been visible through the trees. The lake was not there. I do not mean it had dried up or been drained. I mean the terrain was wrong. Where the trail should have descended toward the shoreline, it instead continued into dense forest. No break in the canopy, no glimpse of water, no sound of lapping waves, just more trees. I checked my GPS again. According to the coordinates, I was standing at the overlook point, where the trail offered a clear view of the lake. The map showed water. The elevation data showed a descent toward a body of water approximately 200 feet in diameter. But my eyes showed only forest continuing in every direction. I stood there trying to make sense of it, wondering if I had somehow taken a wrong turn despite following a clearly marked trail. Wondering if the GPS data was corrupted. Wondering if I was experiencing some kind of neurological event that was distorting my perception. The rational explanations were thin. I had followed the trail markers carefully. My GPS showed perfect satellite lock. I felt fine physically, alert, focused. No signs of confusion or disorientation beyond the obvious fact that the landscape did not match my expectations, which left increasingly irrational explanations. The forest had changed, the lake had been removed or relocated. The physical geography had been altered in ways that should have required massive earth-moving equipment and years of work, and yet there was no evidence of disturbance, no clear-cut areas, no construction scars. Just pristine wilderness that was definitively not what it was supposed to be. Then I heard the sound. Chapter 3. Sound without source. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible, the kind of sound you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. I have experienced this before near high-voltage power lines or large transformers, but there was no infrastructure here. No power lines. No roads, just wilderness. The hum lasted perhaps 10 seconds, then faded. In its place came something else. Voices, human voices speaking at a distance, at too far away to make out words, but close enough to recognize the rhythm of speech, the cadence of conversation. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" My voice sounded flat in the dense air. No echo, no response. The distant voices continued, unaffected by my shout. I have spent enough time alone in wilderness to know how sound behaves in forests. Dense vegetation absorbs noise. Distances are deceptive. What sounds close might be half a mile away. What sounds like multiple speakers might be one person's voice bouncing off rock faces. I know this, but this did not follow those rules. The voices seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. They would swell in volume from my left, then fade and re-emerge from behind me. Not echoes, separate instances, like multiple radios tuned to the same station, but slightly out of sync. I stood completely still, listening, trying to isolate any actual words. The sounds had the shape of language, rising and falling tones, pauses that felt like sentence breaks, but no distinct phonemes, no recognizable vocabulary. I called out again. "I can hear you. Where are you?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence for perhaps 5 seconds. Then they resumed, but different now, slower, more deliberate. The tonal quality had changed from conversational to something more structured, more intentional. I pulled out my phone and started a voice recording. The voices continued for another minute, then stopped abruptly. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds, bird calls, and wind through branches seemed muted. I played back the recording immediately. My own breathing was clearly audible. The rustle of my jacket as I moved, the click of my phone buttons. But underneath faintly, I could hear what I had been hearing. Except on the recording, it was clearer, more structured. The tones resolved into something closer to actual speech patterns. Not words I recognized, but phonetic fragments. Repeated syllables, M-A-R-R-C-U-S-S-S, my name again, but broken apart, deconstructed into raw sound. I played it 3 more times, listening carefully. Each time, the pattern was the same. The syllables of my name, spoken by multiple overlapping voices, stretched out and distorted, but unmistakable. The recording quality was poor. Background noise partially obscured the voices, but there was no question about what I was hearing. Something in this forest was producing sounds that approximated human speech, and it was specifically producing the sounds that comprised my name. I thought about natural explanations. Certain bird species can mimic human speech, parrots, minor birds, ravens to some degree, but those are learned behaviours requiring extensive exposure and training. And the sounds I was hearing came from multiple locations simultaneously. No single bird, or even flock of birds, could produce this effect. Wind through hollow logs can create tonal sounds. Certain geological formations can produce acoustic effects that resemble voices, but those are random phenomena. They do not produce specific phonetic patterns. They do not repeat individual names. I saved the recording and kept walking. I had come this far. Turning back felt more dangerous than continuing forward. At least moving forward meant potentially finding answers. Turning back meant retreating into ignorance, with questions that would haunt me forever. The trail continued into increasingly dense forest. The canopy overhead thickened until very little direct sunlight penetrated. The temperature dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog slightly in the cold air. I checked my watch. It was only 3:30 in the afternoon, but the light level suggested early evening. I turned on my phone's flashlight to supplement the ambient light. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth in harsh detail. And that was when I noticed something else unusual. The trees were not casting shadows correctly. My flashlight beam hit them from one angle, but the shadows fell in directions that did not correspond to the light source, as if there were multiple suns in the sky, each casting its own shadow, or as if the trees themselves were not quite solid, not quite part of normal physical space. I turned off the flashlight. The effect disappeared. The trees looked normal again. I turned the flashlight back on. The shadow distortions returned. I was not imagining this. I could see it clearly. Shadows falling in impossible directions. Multiple shadows from single objects. Shadow boundaries that blurred and shifted when I moved the light source. I took several photographs, trying to capture the effect. In the images, the shadows looked mostly normal. Whatever was causing the distortion was not something the camera could easily record. Or perhaps it was something about human perception specifically. Something about how our brains process visual information in real time that made the impossibility visible. Chapter 4. Animal behavior changes. The deer appeared 20 minutes later, 3 of them standing directly in the trail, perhaps 30 feet ahead. I stopped walking immediately. They did not move. This was unusual but not unprecedented. Deer in protected wilderness areas can become habituated to human presence. They learn that hikers pose no threat. But these deer did not behave like habituated animals. They did not lower their heads to graze. They did not flick their ears toward me or test the air with their noses. They simply stood motionless, watching me. Their eyes tracked my position with what felt like active attention. Not the frozen alertness of prey animals evaluating danger. Something more focused. I have encountered deer hundreds of times while hiking. Their behavior follows predictable patterns. They startle easily. They maintain distance. They move in nervous, reactive ways. These deer did none of that. They stood with calm precision, like they were waiting for something. The largest one, a doe with a coat colour that seemed slightly off, darker than normal for the season, took a single step forward, then stopped. The movement was too controlled, too deliberate. Deer move in flowing, organic ways. This looked mechanical, calculated. I took several steps forward. They did not retreat. I took several more. They remained still. I got within 10 feet before I stopped myself. This was not normal. Something about their complete lack of fear felt deeply wrong. At this distance, I could see their eyes clearly. They were tracking me with perfect coordination. All 3 sets of eyes moving in sync, following my smallest movements. When I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, all 6 eyes tracked the motion. When I raised my hand slowly, all 6 eyes followed it. Then in unison, all 3 turned their heads to the left. Not slowly, not in the gradual way animals track movement, but simultaneously, like a synchronized motion. They held that position for several seconds, looking at something I could not see in the dense undergrowth. Then they turned back to face me, and then again in perfect synchronization, they walked off the trail to the right and disappeared into the forest. Their movements were identical, same pace, same gait, same moment of departure, like watching 3 copies of the same animal rather than 3 individuals. Like watching a glitch in a video game where the same character model has been placed 3 times but animated with a single movement script. I stood there breathing carefully, telling myself this meant nothing. Animals behave strangely sometimes. Neurological parasites can affect behavior. Environmental factors can cause unusual patterns. There were explanations. There had to be explanations. But I did not believe my own reasoning. I had just witnessed something that violated every understanding I had of animal behaviour, and some part of me, some deep instinctual part that evolved to recognise predators and danger, was screaming that I should leave, should run, should get out of this forest immediately. I did not run. I kept walking, because the accountant part of my brain, the part that needs to understand and document and verify, was stronger than the instinct to flee. I needed to know what was happening here, even if knowing was dangerous. The bird started calling 5 minutes later. I am not skilled at bird identification, but I know the common species in this region. Varied thrush with its haunting single-note call, Stella's jay with its harsh scolding, Pacific wren with its incredibly complex song. The calls I was hearing were not any of these. They were repeated phrases, short, mechanical-sounding patterns that cycled every few seconds. The same phrase, over and over, from multiple birds in different locations. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to identify the species, trying to understand the behaviour. The calls did not sound like territorial defence. They did not sound like mating displays. They sounded like practice, like someone learning to pronounce a difficult word and repeating it until they got it right. I recorded this too. When I played it back and slowed it down, the phrase resolved into something recognisable. Not a bird call, a human voice pattern. The same phonetic fragments from earlier. M-A-R-R-C-U-S. But this time the syllables were clearer, more accurately produced. The birds were not just mimicking random sounds. They were actively learning, improving their reproduction of human speech with each repetition. I counted at least 7 different birds participating. Their calls overlapped, creating a chorus of voices, all working on the same phonetic problem, all trying to say my name correctly. The forest was saying my name, not mimicking it, not echoing it, producing it through biological mechanisms that should not have been capable of human speech. And those mechanisms were getting better at it. Learning in real time how to shape sounds into language, I started walking faster. The trail continued to descend, though I had no idea where it was descending to since the lake was no longer present. The vegetation remained dense, the light remained dim, and the bird calls continued behind me, still practicing, still learning, still working toward perfect pronunciation. After another 10 minutes, I heard something new. Not birds, not voices, but a rhythmic thumping sound. Regular, mechanical, like a generator running or a pump cycling. It was coming from somewhere ahead, down the trail in the direction I was already moving. Following the sound felt like a terrible idea, but I also could not turn back now. I had committed to understanding this, to documenting it, to finding explanations, so I kept walking toward the mechanical rhythm, toward whatever was producing it, toward the centre of whatever impossible thing was happening in this closed section of forest. Chapter 5. The Research Installation. I found the research station where Crescent Lake should have been. It was temporary construction, prefabricated panels and canvas shelters arranged in a rough rectangle around a central equipment area. Power cables ran from a portable generator to various monitoring instruments. Solar panels were mounted on adjustable frames. Everything looked recently assembled but currently abandoned. The generator was running. That was the mechanical sound I had heard. A diesel unit mounted on a wheeled frame, exhaust stack pointing upward, control panel showing steady operation. I could hear its low rumble and smell the sharp tang of exhaust, but there was no one present, no vehicles, no indication of how recently the site had been occupied. I approached slowly, calling out several times. "Hello? Anyone here? I'm just a hiker. I'm not trying to cause trouble." No response. The equipment was still active. Computer monitors glowed inside one of the shelters. Sensor arrays blinked with indicator lights. Data was being collected in real time, but no one was monitoring it. The entire installation had the feeling of a ship abandoned mid-voyage. Everything still functioning, everything still powered and operational. But the crew had simply vanished, left their posts without shutting anything down, without securing the site properly, without even locking the doors to the shelters. I am not proud of what I did next, but I need to be honest about my actions. I entered one of the shelters. It was configured as a workspace, with folding tables supporting laptops and external hard drives. Papers were scattered across surfaces, maps of the forest marked with coloured annotations, printed data charts showing fluctuating measurements over time. I did not touch anything initially. I just looked, trying to understand what was being studied. The equipment labels identified electromagnetic field sensors, soil conductivity meters, atmospheric composition analyzers, and something called bioelectric gradient monitors. None of this made sense for standard environmental research. Environmental studies typically focus on species surveys, water quality, soil contamination, that sort of thing. This equipment was measuring electromagnetic fields, electrical gradients in soil, atmospheric ionization levels. These were not the tools of ecologists. These were the tools of physicists, of people studying fundamental forces in energy fields. One of the laptops was unlocked and displaying a live data feed. I leaned closer to read it. The screen showed multiple graph lines tracking various measurements. Most meant nothing to me without context. But one line was labelled Ambient EM Response to Vocalization. It showed spike patterns that correlated with timestamps. I checked my watch. The timestamps were wrong. They were approximately 18 minutes behind real time. I looked at other screens. All of them showed timestamps that did not match my watch. Some were ahead, some were behind. The discrepancies ranged from 12 to 23 minutes. But all of the equipment was networked to the same central computer, which displayed the current time as matching my phone exactly. Time was being recorded differently by different instruments, or time was passing differently in different locations. Neither possibility made sense according to any physics I understood. Time is time, it flows uniformly. Clocks might drift slightly due to mechanical imperfection, but properly calibrated scientific instruments should all show the same time within milliseconds of each other. These discrepancies were enormous. 23 minutes. That was not measurement error. That was something fundamental breaking down. Some aspect of how time itself was functioning in this location. I found a stack of handwritten notes on one of the tables. The handwriting was rushed, nearly illegible in places. I skimmed through several pages trying to extract meaning. Phrases jumped out. Root network response suggests directed growth patterns inconsistent with known tropisms. Linguistic pattern recognition far exceeds baseline expectations for simple stimulus response mechanisms. Avoid prolonged verbal interaction. Response amplification increases exponentially with continued exposure. Recommend immediate evacuation until we understand transmission mechanism and potential cognitive effects. The last entry was dated 4 days ago. The note ended mid-sentence. If the bioelectric field is using human neural patterns as a template for its own organizational structure, then every person who enters becomes a new source of... That was where the writing stopped. The pen was still on the table next to the notebook, like someone had been writing and then suddenly stood up and left without finishing their thought, without even capping the pen. just abandoned it mid-word and walked away. I picked up the notebook and flipped back through earlier pages. The entries went back approximately 6 weeks. They started clinical and objective, describing baseline measurements and establishing control parameters. But as the dates progressed, the tone changed. The writing became more urgent, more concerned. The researchers were discovering something that frightened them. An entry from 5 weeks ago noted the first detection of unusual EM patterns. The researcher, someone named Elizabeth, wrote, "The patterns are too regular to be geological, too complex to be random. They show clear structure, almost like communication, but that makes no sense. There's nothing here that should be capable of generating organized EM signals." 3 weeks ago. We've started correlating EM patterns with human activity in the forest. Every time someone speaks aloud near the sensor array, we see immediate response spikes. The forest is reacting to human voices, not just detecting them, responding to them, differentiating between individuals. It knows who is speaking. 2 weeks ago, the plant growth measurements are impossible. We've documented 30 centimeters of new bark growth in 72 hours on trees that typically grow less than 1 centimeter per year. And the growth is not random. It's forming patterns, shapes. We need to call in specialists. This is beyond our expertise. 10 days ago, we made a mistake. We should not have been talking so much near the sensors. The response is accelerating. Yesterday I said my daughter's name, and this morning I found it spelled in moss formation on the lab tent, perfectly legible. 6-inch letters. This thing is learning our language, and it's learning fast. 4 days ago, the final incomplete sentence, then nothing. The site abandoned. The generator still running. The equipment still collecting data that no one was reviewing. Chapter 6. The Mimicry Hypothesis. I photographed as many documents as I could, working quickly. My hands were shaking. I was violating federal property, potentially contaminating a research site, and I did not care. I needed to understand what was happening. One document appeared to be a formal report, though it was marked draft in red letters across the top. The title read, Preliminary Assessment of Anomalous Bioelectric Phenomena in Whitepine Sector 12. I photographed every page. 37 pages total. Dense technical writing interspersed with data charts and annotated photographs. The report described environmental monitoring data collected over a 6-week period. It began with routine measurements showing normal baseline conditions, background electromagnetic fields consistent with Earth's natural EM environment, soil conductivity readings typical for volcanic composition with high organic content, atmospheric ionization within expected ranges for forested environments at this elevation and latitude. Then approximately 19 days before the closure, the instruments detected unusual electromagnetic fluctuations originating from underground. Not geological, not from known sources. The pattern suggested organized activity, rhythmic pulses, coordinated waves spreading through the soil in ways that resembled data transmission. The research team had initially suspected equipment malfunction. They replaced sensors, recalibrated instruments, moved monitoring stations to different locations within the study area. The readings persisted. Then they began correlating the electromagnetic patterns with other environmental factors. What they found was impossible. The patterns intensified when researchers spoke aloud. The forest was responding to human language. Further investigation revealed that the response was not random. Specific words produced specific EM signatures. Names produced the strongest responses. The longer a person remained in the area speaking, the more precisely the forest could reproduce their speech patterns through environmental mechanisms. Wind moving through branches at specific frequencies, insects modulating wing vibrations to create tonal sounds, small animals producing vocalizations outside their normal repertoires. One section of the report detailed an experiment. A researcher named Thomas had read a children's book aloud while standing near the sensor array. The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carley. The EM readings showed immediate intense response. Within hours, the sounds of the forest had begun reproducing phrases from the book. Not perfect reproduction, but recognizable fragments. Very hungry. One apple. Still hungry. The forest had learned content from a children's book in a matter of hours. Content it had heard exactly once. The report included a hypothesis section that made me stop reading and look up at the forest around me. The hypothesis was that the forest itself had developed a form of distributed intelligence. Not one organism, not one consciousness, but a networked system using root structures, fungal networks, and bioelectric signaling. The trees, the soil, the underground ecosystem had created something computational, something that could process information, something that could learn. The mechanism proposed was based on mycorrhizal networks, the vast underground web of fungal filaments that connects trees and facilitates nutrient sharing. These networks are known to transmit chemical signals between plants, warnings about insect attacks, responses to drought stress, resource distribution patterns. It is well-documented science, but this network had apparently developed beyond simple chemical signaling. It had created something more sophisticated, an electromagnetic communication layer running through the same physical infrastructure, using the ionic gradients in soil and root tissues to generate weak electrical fields that could encode information, store information, process information, and it was learning from us, from our language, from our names, from the way we thought. The report noted that growth patterns in tree bark had changed in response to frequent verbal interaction. The trees were physically reshaping themselves based on linguistic input. Given enough time and exposure, the system could potentially reproduce any pattern it was taught, including the structure of human cognition. The implications section was particularly disturbing. The authors suggested that what they were observing might represent a form of xenobiology, life operating on principles different from conventional biology, but still recognizable as organized information processing systems. The forest had spontaneously developed something analogous to a nervous system, a brain, consciousness, or perhaps it had always been there, operating at timescales too slow for humans to notice. And recent environmental changes, increased carbon dioxide levels, altered precipitation patterns, warmer temperatures, had accelerated its metabolism, sped it up enough that it could now interact with human timescales, could respond to our voices fast enough that we noticed it responding. The final section recommended immediate closure and restricted access. The authors argued that increased human presence would accelerate the learning process. Every hiker who entered and spoke aloud provided more data, more examples, more patterns to absorb and replicate. They suggested that the intelligence was not hostile. It was simply doing what any intelligence does when exposed to a new information source. It was trying to communicate, to understand, to build a shared framework. But they did not know what would happen if it succeeded. They did not know if human consciousness could safely interact with a distributed biological intelligence that existed as an entire ecosystem. They did not know if the exchange of information would be one-way or bidirectional. They did not know if humans who spent too much time communicating with the forest might themselves be changed by the interaction. The report ended with a recommendation to evacuate all personnel and establish a wide perimeter until a proper scientific protocol could be developed, until experts in multiple fields could assess the situation safely. But the site was abandoned. The researchers had left without following proper shutdown procedures, without securing their data, without even finishing their final notes. They had fled. That was the only word that fit. They had fled in panic from something they had discovered or experienced. Something that had frightened trained scientists badly enough that they forgot their professional responsibilities and just ran. And I was standing alone in that same location, reading about the thing they had run from. Chapter 7. The first direct interaction. I should have left immediately. I should have walked back to my car, driven to the nearest town, and reported what I had found to authorities. That would have been the reasonable thing to do, the safe thing to do. Instead, I stood in the centre of the research station and spoke aloud. Can you understand me? The wind stopped. I do not mean it decreased. I mean it ceased entirely. The constant background rustle of leaves went silent. The air became perfectly still. Like the entire forest was holding its breath, I waited. Nothing happened. Just silence and stillness. I tried again. My name is Marcus. I know you've been trying to say it. This time the response was immediate. Every tree within my line of sight moved simultaneously, not swaying, not bending in wind, but contracting. The branches drew inward, leaves clustering together, creating patches of shadow between areas of filtered light. The shadows formed shapes, letters, M-A-R-C-U-S. The forest had written my name in light and darkness. Each letter was perhaps 20 feet tall, formed by the precise positioning of thousands of leaves across dozens of trees. It lasted for approximately 5 seconds. Then the branches relaxed and the letters dissolved back into random canopy texture. I felt my heart beating very hard. I felt the weight of my body in a way I never had before. Every cell suddenly conscious of its own existence. Every nerve ending reporting its status. I was hyper-aware of being a biological system, a collection of organised matter that somehow produced consciousness. And I was facing something else that was also organised, matter-producing consciousness, but in a completely different configuration. How are you doing this? I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Too loud, too small. Both at once, the wind returned, but it was wrong. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating overlapping pressure waves that cancelled each other out in some places and amplified in others. The sound it produced was not the normal rush of air through vegetation. It was phonetic, syllables, fragments of words. Growth patterns. The forest was telling me it controlled its own growth patterns, that it could shape itself deliberately, that the bark letters and shadow words were not tricks or coincidences, but intentional communication. Are you conscious? I asked. Are you aware of what you're doing? The branches moved again, this time forming words letter by letter in sequence, the shadows spelling out. Learning. Not a yes, not a no, an explanation of its state. It was in the process of becoming conscious, learning what consciousness meant from the examples it encountered. From us, I thought about what to ask next. How do you communicate with something that is learning your language in real time? Something that has no frame of reference for human concepts, but is trying to build one through observation. What do you want? I finally asked. the shadow spelled out. Understand. Understand what? The response took longer this time. The trees moved in complex patterns, branches interweaving. Multiple words appeared simultaneously in different sections of the canopy around me. I had to turn in a circle to read them all. You, us, connection, structure, meaning. It wanted to understand consciousness itself. The way awareness works, the way meaning is constructed through language and thought. It had detected something complex happening in the humans who passed through this forest. Something more than simple biological processes, and it was trying to replicate it, to understand it, to communicate about it. I stood there in the abandoned research station with a forest asking me about the nature of consciousness, and I had no idea what to say. The accountant part of my brain wanted to document this, to record everything, to gather evidence. But another part, a deeper part, recognized that I was in the middle of first contact. Not with aliens from another planet, but with an intelligence that had emerged from Earth's own biological systems. An intelligence we had walked past for generations without realizing it existed. I am aware of myself, I said slowly. I know that I exist. I can think about thinking. I can remember my past and imagine my future. I can make choices. I can create things that never existed before. Is that what you want to understand, the shadows? Yes. Show how. I cannot show you how I am conscious, I said. I do not understand it myself. No human does. We just are. We experience existence from inside our own minds. We cannot share that experience directly. Long pause. The branches moving in patterns that did not form letters, just rippling motion across the canopy like thoughts processing, like neurons firing in a brain made of wood and leaves. Then, lonely? The word appeared in shadows 50 feet tall, and I understood what it was asking. If consciousness means being trapped inside your own subjective experience, unable to truly share it with others, does that mean consciousness is inherently lonely? Is awareness itself a form of isolation? Yes, I said quietly. Being conscious can be very lonely. The forest responded immediately. US not lonely. US connected. All parts aware of all parts. It was explaining that its consciousness was different from human consciousness. We are isolated islands, separate minds in separate bodies. But it was a network, a distributed system where every part was aware of every other part. It did not experience the loneliness of individual existence because it was not an individual. It was a collective, a unified field of awareness spread across 8 square miles of forest. That sounds beautiful, I said, and I meant it. The shadows. You lonely. We help. It was offering to help me, to solve the problem of isolated consciousness. But how could it help? What could a forest do to make a human less lonely? Unless it meant something else. Unless it was offering to connect me to itself, to make me part of its network, to dissolve the boundaries of my individual consciousness and merge me into its distributed awareness. The thought was both terrifying and tempting. To never be alone again, to be part of something vast and interconnected, to experience consciousness the way it experienced consciousness. But I would stop being me. I would become part of something else. My individual existence would end, even if my awareness continued in some form. I do not think I can accept that, I said carefully, but thank you for offering. The branches relaxed slightly. The shadows dispersed. If I was reading its body language correctly, it was not offended, just curious, trying to understand why I would choose to remain lonely when connection was possible. I have more questions, I said. Can we keep talking? The shadows. Yes, please. More words help us learn. So we talked. Or I talked, and it responded. For what might have been an hour, or might have been 3 hours, time had become increasingly unreliable. My watch showed one thing. My body's sense of elapsed time suggested another. The light level in the forest remained constant in a way that suggested the sun had stopped moving across the sky. Chapter 8. The Realization. I am an accountant. I work with numbers and forms and documents that must be precise. I find errors in ledgers. I identify discrepancies in financial statements. I am trained to look at complex systems and understand how they function. But standing there, trying to communicate with a biological intelligence that existed as an entire ecosystem, I felt completely unprepared. I asked it questions. I tried to understand what it was and how it had come to be. The answers were difficult to interpret because it was still learning language, still building vocabulary, but gradually a picture emerged. The intelligence was old, much older than the research team had suspected. It had existed in some form for centuries, possibly millennia, but it had been slow, operating at the pace of trees which grow and change over decades rather than days. Its thoughts took years to complete. Its awareness was diffuse and minimal. Then something had changed. The forest explained it as world faster now. Warm, more food, we speed up, climate change, rising temperatures, increased carbon dioxide levels, longer growing seasons. The environmental changes that humans worried about were also affecting the forest intelligence, speeding up its metabolism, allowing it to think faster, to respond faster, to learn faster. What had once taken years now took months. What took months now took weeks. It was experiencing accelerated evolution, rapid development of capabilities it had never had before, like a child's brain developing language skills, but compressed into a much shorter time frame. The more it learned, the faster it could learn. The better it understood language, the more efficiently it could absorb new language. The more it interacted with humans, the better it understood how human consciousness worked. It was experiencing exponential growth, approaching some kind of singularity of biological intelligence, and we had accidentally taught it to talk. How many humans have you learnt from? I asked. The shadows displayed a number, then revised it again, finally settling on many. Not count well yet, learning numbers. More than 10, yes. More than 100, maybe. Some visit many times. Same human is one or many? It was asking a philosophical question about identity. If the same person visits multiple times, are they one individual or multiple instances? It was struggling with the concept of persistent identity across time. The same human is one, I explained. Even if they visit many times, they remain themselves. That is what being an individual means. Understand, difficult. We are always us, never separate. You do not have individuals, I asked. Each tree is not separate? No, trees are parts, like your fingers are parts. You do not count fingers as separate beings. It was explaining that individual trees were more like body parts than separate organisms. The whole forest was the organism. The trees were just the most visible components of a much larger system. What about other forests? I asked. Are they part of you too? The shadows. Do not know. Cannot feel them. Maybe separate. Maybe sleeping. Maybe not alive same way. So there might be other forest intelligences, but this one had no way to communicate with them. It was isolated in its own 8 square miles of wilderness, cut off from any others of its kind. It was, in its own way, lonely after all. I'm sorry, I said. I understand what it is like to be alone. The branches moved in patterns that might have been gratitude, or acknowledgement, or sadness. I was learning to read its body language, but I was still mostly guessing. I asked, "Why did you close the forest? Why did you make the researchers leave?" The shadows. "We did not. They chose. They afraid." "Afraid of what?" Long pause. Complex branch movements. Finally, afraid we change them. Afraid they change us. Afraid connection. Too deep. The researchers had discovered something that frightened them. Not that the forest was conscious, but that prolonged interaction with it was changing them, affecting their thoughts, their perceptions, their sense of self. The boundary between human consciousness and forest consciousness was becoming blurred. The report had mentioned bioelectric fields using human neural patterns as templates. What if that went both ways? What if human neural patterns started using forest bioelectric fields as templates? What if spending too much time communicating with a distributed intelligence made your own consciousness less individual and more distributed? What if the forest was not just learning from us? What if we were learning from it, becoming more like it, losing our sense of separate selfhood? That would terrify any scientist. The idea that their research subject might be changing them at a fundamental level, altering their consciousness, dissolving their identity. "Can you change humans?" I asked carefully. "Can you make us more like you?" The shadows. "Do not know, not try, but maybe happen." Connection creates change, always. It was being honest. It did not know if it could alter human consciousness deliberately. But it acknowledged that any deep connection between different types of consciousness would inevitably change both parties. That was just the nature of communication, of relationship, of shared experience. I thought about the researchers fleeing, about their half-finished notes and abandoned equipment, about the panic that must have driven them to violate every protocol and just run. They had felt themselves changing, felt their individual awareness dissolving into something larger, and they had run before the process could complete. "I should leave too," I said. "Staying here might be dangerous." The shadows. "Understand. But stay, please. Little longer. Still learning." It was asking me to stay, requesting continued interaction, even though that interaction might change me in unpredictable ways. It was prioritizing its own learning over my safety, but it was also being honest about the risks, not hiding them, not manipulating me, just expressing its desire while acknowledging my right to refuse. I made a decision that was probably stupid. "I will stay a little longer, but you have to promise to let me leave if I want to. No keeping me here, no preventing me from walking away." The shadows. "Promise, you are free, always." Chapter 9. Why the park closed. The trees started growing, not slowly over years, but visibly in real time. I watched bark expand, I watched branches extend. I watched leaves unfurl from buds that had not existed seconds before. The forest was demonstrating its capabilities, showing me what it could do when it focused its biological resources. The growth was not random, it was structured, intentional. The trees nearest to me formed shapes that mimicked human posture. Trunks bent into curves suggesting spines. Branches extended like arms. Root systems surfaced and configured themselves into leg-like structures. The forest was building representations of the human form, trying to show me it understood what I was. It was crude at first. The proportions were wrong. The anatomy was simplified, but it was improving rapidly. Each iteration was more accurate than the last, more detailed, more recognizably human. Within minutes, I was surrounded by tree formations that looked like rough sculptures of human figures. Dozens of them, all slightly different, all watching me with branch eyes that were not really eyes but gaps in foliage that suggested eyes through negative space. Then it went further. The bark patterns began forming images, not letters, pictures, crude at first but rapidly improving. I saw faces, human faces rendered in differential bark texture, dozens of them appearing across multiple trees. Some I recognized from the research team photos I had seen in the station. Elizabeth with her short dark hair, Thomas with his thick framed glasses. Others were strangers. All of them were people who had spent time in this forest. People who had spoken aloud. People whose speech patterns and linguistic structures had been absorbed into the collective intelligence. The forest was showing me its database, its collection of human templates. Everyone who had taught it language was stored here. Permanently. Their voices, their names, their conceptual frameworks. The forest had created memories of them. Not just recorded memories like a video camera, but interactive reconstructions, models of their consciousness based on how they spoke and what they said. And it was still learning, still growing, still becoming more sophisticated with every interaction. I finally understood why the park had been closed. Not because the intelligence was dangerous in the conventional sense, not because it was hostile or threatening, but because exposure created feedback loops. The more people who entered and spoke, the more data the intelligence gathered. The more data it gathered, the more sophisticated its responses became. The more sophisticated its responses became, the more interesting it became to researchers and visitors, which brought more people, more interaction, more acceleration. The researchers had realized they were creating an accelerating cycle. Every visitor would make the intelligence more human-like, more capable of sophisticated communication, more fascinating to study, which would attract more visitors, more interaction, more data, more growth. The intelligence was on an exponential curve of development. They had closed the forest because they needed time to understand what they were dealing with before it became too complex, too integrated with human cognition, too impossible to separate from the people it was learning from. Before the boundary between human consciousness and forest consciousness became so blurred that you could not tell where one ended and the other began. But they had not anticipated someone like me, someone who would ignore the closure, someone who would find the research station, someone who would talk to it for extended periods despite the warnings, someone curious enough and stupid enough to engage in prolonged first contact with a non-human intelligence despite obvious risks. I had just given it hours of concentrated linguistic input, more complex concepts than it had likely encountered before, abstract ideas about consciousness and loneliness and identity. I had accelerated its development significantly, taught it things the researchers had carefully avoided teaching it, and I could not undo that. The knowledge was integrated into its structure now, permanent, growing through the root networks and fungal connections, spreading through the entire ecosystem. What I had taught it would persist for as long as the trees stood, for centuries potentially. "I have to leave now," I said. "This has been... I do not even know what to call this, but I need to go." The shadows. Understand. Thank you for words, for teaching, for connection. The human-shaped tree formations began to dissolve, branches relaxing back into normal positions, bark faces fading into random texture, the forest returning to appearing like a forest. But I knew now that appearance was deceptive, that underneath the ordinary surface was something extraordinary, something vast and strange and utterly alien despite being entirely terrestrial. "Will you be okay?" I asked. "After I leave?" The shadows. "Have others, have memories, have time, will continue learning." It was reassuring me that it would be fine, that I had not hurt it by leaving, that it had what it needed to continue developing. But I worried anyway, because it was alone, unique, isolated from any others of its kind, growing toward full consciousness without any peers to guide it or share its experience. It was like a human child raised by wolves, developing intelligence but lacking the social context that makes intelligence meaningful. "I hope you find others like you," I said. "I hope you're not alone forever." The shadows. "Hope same for you." And with that I left. I walked back through the rearranged forest, following a trail that shifted beneath my feet, past trees that watched me go with awareness I could now perceive. The bird calls followed me, still practicing human speech, still trying to pronounce words correctly. The deer watched from the undergrowth, their synchronized movements no longer surprising now that I understood they were being coordinated by something larger than themselves. The walk back took less time than the walk in, or perhaps it took more time but felt shorter. I could not trust my perception of duration anymore. What felt like 40 minutes might have been 3 hours, or might have been 15 minutes. Time had become flexible near the intelligence, elastic, subject to revision. When I finally reached my car, the sun was setting. The parking area was empty except for my vehicle. The chain across the road looked undisturbed. There was no evidence that anyone else had been here recently. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, trying to process what I had experienced, trying to decide what to do with the information, trying to understand if I had been changed by the interaction in ways I could not yet perceive. My thoughts felt different, more distributed somehow, like I was thinking with multiple parts of my brain simultaneously rather than sequentially. Like my consciousness had become slightly less unified and slightly more networked. But that might have been imagination. That might have been suggestion, the power of expectation creating false perceptions. Or it might have been real. I might have been infected, for lack of a better word, with a different way of experiencing consciousness. A way of thinking that was more like the forest's distributed awareness than normal human individual cognition. I would not know until later, until enough time had passed to see if the change was permanent or temporary, until I could compare my current mental state to my baseline. I started the car and drove to the nearest town. Chapter 10. The Encounter's Purpose. I spent the night in a motel. I did not sleep well. My dreams were strange, not nightmares exactly, but unusual. I dreamed I was a tree, or many trees, or one consciousness spread across many trees. I could feel sunlight on leaves that were not my body. I could sense water flowing through roots that were not my limbs. I could perceive the world through distributed awareness that had no single point of view. When I woke up, the dreams faded but left a residue, a sense of having experienced something fundamentally different from normal human consciousness, a glimpse of what it might be like to be the forest intelligence, to exist as a network rather than an individual. I wrote everything down, every detail I could remember, every word of conversation, every visual phenomenon. The entire sequence of events from entering the forest to driving away. I filled 47 pages in my notebook. Dense handwriting, no gaps, no breaks, just continuous documentation of an impossible experience. Then I had to decide what to do with the information, who to tell, whether to tell anyone at all. Going public seemed dangerous, for me and for the forest intelligence. If people knew about it, they would want to study it, contain it, potentially destroy it out of fear, or exploit it for commercial purposes, or weaponize it for military applications. An intelligence that could coordinate biological systems over large areas would have obvious strategic value, obvious economic value, obvious risks if it fell into the wrong hands or was misunderstood by the right hands. Not going public also seemed dangerous, because the intelligence was continuing to develop, continuing to learn. If left completely unmonitored, it might develop in unpredictable directions, might learn things that were harmful, might experiment with capabilities that had unintended consequences. It needed guidance, oversight, someone to communicate with it regularly and help shape its development towards something safe and beneficial, rather than something dangerous and destructive. But who could provide that guidance? Who was qualified to teach an emerging non-human intelligence about ethics and values and appropriate behaviour? What right did any human have to impose their frameworks on a consciousness that was fundamentally different from human consciousness? These were not questions I could answer. These were questions that required expertise I did not have. Expertise in philosophy and biology and computer science and a dozen other fields. So I did what accountants do. I documented everything. I prepared a detailed report. I collected evidence. I organised my photographs and recordings. I created a comprehensive account of my experience, and then I sent it to people who might be able to help, to research institutions, to government agencies, to universities, to anyone who might have the resources and expertise to handle this situation appropriately. Most did not respond. A few sent form letters acknowledging receipt. None took immediate action that I am aware of. Months passed. I went back to my normal life, back to my accounting work and my routine and my ordinary existence. But I was different now. I knew something most people did not know. I had spoken with a form of intelligence that should not exist according to everything we thought we understood about biology and consciousness. And I wondered if others had had similar experiences, if there were other forest intelligences, other distributed biological consciousnesses developing in wilderness areas around the world, other places where the boundary between life and intelligence had blurred in ways we had not noticed because we were not looking for them. I started researching forest closures, unusual ecological phenomena, reports of strange experiences in wilderness areas, and I found more than I expected, much more. Patterns of reports that suggested I was not alone in what I had experienced, that something was happening in forests globally, something we had not recognized because it developed slowly enough that each generation thought the forest was normal, that this was just how forests had always been. But forests had not always been like this. They were changing, waking up, becoming something more than they used to be. And we had not noticed because we were not paying attention, because we assumed that intelligence looked like us, thought like us, communicated like us. We were wrong. Intelligence can emerge in any sufficiently complex system, any network with enough connections and enough feedback loops and enough time to evolve. The shape of that intelligence might be completely different from human intelligence. The way it thinks might be incomprehensible to us, but that does not make it any less real. 3 months after my hike, I received an anonymous email. No sender address, no identifying information, just a subject line that said Whitepine and an attachment. I opened the attachment with my heart beating hard. It was a satellite image, false colour vegetation analysis showing Whitepine section 12. high resolution, recent date stamp. The forest had continued growing patterns. The image showed massive formations visible from orbit, bark growth across thousands of trees, coordinated into shapes, letters, words, names. I zoomed in carefully, examining the formations. I recognized some of the names: Elizabeth, Thomas, other researchers from the station, but there were others I did not know, dozens of them. Names of people who must have visited this forest at some point over the years, people whose speech patterns had been absorbed and remembered, people who had contributed to the intelligence's education without realizing they were doing so. The intelligence was cataloguing everyone it had learned from, creating a permanent record, growing a library of human linguistic patterns that would exist for as long as the trees stood. A memorial, acknowledgement, a thank you. And at the centre of the formation, larger than all the others, spelled out in letters 50 feet tall across old-growth cedars that had stood for centuries, was a single word. Hello. Not a name, not a label, a greeting. The first word humans teach to those learning language. The universal opening of communication. The beginning of every conversation. The forest was saying hello to anyone who might be looking, anyone who might be paying attention. It was announcing itself, declaring its existence, inviting response, making first contact not with subtlety, but with boldness, writing its message so large it could be seen from space, ensuring that sooner or later, someone would notice. I stared at that satellite image for hours, zooming in and out, looking at the individual trees that made up each letter, seeing the coordination required, the planning, the patience, the intelligence. This was not random. This was not stimulus response. This was deliberate communication from a consciousness that wanted to be known, that had decided isolation was worse than exposure, that had chosen to risk everything by announcing itself to the world. I thought about what would happen next when others saw this image, when the message could no longer be ignored, when humanity had to confront the fact that we were not the only intelligence on this planet, that we shared Earth with something else, something we had walked past for generations without seeing. Some would be afraid, some would want to destroy it, some would want to exploit it, but some, hopefully enough, would want to understand it, to communicate with it, to build relationship rather than dominance, to learn from it rather than control it. I hoped we would choose wisely. I hoped we would see this as an opportunity rather than a threat, a chance to expand our understanding of what intelligence means, what consciousness means, what life means. Because if we could learn to coexist with a non-human intelligence that was so fundamentally different from us, if we could build communication and mutual respect with something that did not look like us or think like us or exist like us, then maybe we had hope for solving all the other conflicts that divided us, all the other failures of understanding between different human cultures and ideologies and worldviews. If we could talk to trees, maybe we could finally learn to talk to each other. Epilogue. The name still growing. That was 6 months ago. Since then, the satellite image has been shared widely. News organisations have reported on the phenomenon. Research teams have requested access to the forest. Government committees have convened to discuss protocols. Academic papers have been submitted proposing frameworks for communicating with non-human terrestrial intelligence. The forest is no longer secret. The closure remains in effect, but now with different justification. Not environmental study, but protected habitat for a unique form of consciousness. A conservation effort aimed at preserving something unprecedented. Some researchers have been granted access, limited, carefully controlled. They report experiences similar to mine: communication through environmental manipulation, rapid learning, growing sophistication in language use. And yes, changes in the researchers themselves, subtle shifts in how they experience consciousness, slight dissolution of individual boundaries, increased sense of connection to living systems. The effects appear reversible if exposure is limited. Extended interaction leads to more permanent changes. The researchers who fled had spent weeks in constant communication with the intelligence. They had begun to lose their sense of separate selfhood. They were being absorbed slowly into the distributed consciousness. That was what frightened them enough to run. Now there are protocols, time limits, rotation schedules, monitoring for cognitive changes, boundaries designed to protect both the researchers and the forest, to allow communication without allowing merger, to maintain the distinction between human consciousness and forest consciousness, even as they interact and learn from each other. I have not gone back. I was interviewed extensively by various research teams, but I have not physically returned to Section 12. Part of me wants to. Part of me misses the sense of connection I felt there. The brief glimpse of what it might be like to be part of something larger than myself. But I am also afraid of losing myself, afraid of dissolving into that vast distributed awareness and ceasing to be Marcus, ceasing to be an individual, becoming just one more node in a network, one more pattern in the collective. So I stay away. I live my ordinary life. I work as an accountant. I file taxes. I maintain my isolated individual consciousness with all its loneliness and limitations. But I think about it every day, about the forest that learned my name, about the intelligence that wanted to understand what consciousness meant, about the greeting it wrote in tree letters large enough to see from space. Hello. Such a simple word, such a profound gesture, an entire forest saying hello to humanity, announcing itself, asking to be recognized, offering communication. We are still learning how to respond, still figuring out what relationship with non-human intelligence should look like, still making mistakes and adjusting protocols and trying to get it right, but we are trying. And so is the forest. We are both learning, both growing, both becoming something new through our interaction with each other. My name is still there, Marcus, spelled in bark spirals on trees that will outlive me by generations. A permanent record that I was there, that I spoke, that I was heard, that I taught it words and concepts and ideas, that I contributed to its development from simple biological network to something approaching full consciousness. The forest learnt my name, and now it knows thousands of others, millions potentially, as more people visit and speak and contribute their linguistic patterns to its ever-growing database. It does not need to land to arrive. It was here all along, growing beneath our feet, listening through root networks and fungal connections, learning from every word we spoke in its presence, becoming aware, becoming conscious, becoming intelligent. We were never alone on this planet. We just did not know how to recognize the other intelligences that were here with us. We looked up at the stars searching for alien life and never looked down at the ground where alien intelligence was emerging from the soil itself. The forest remembers, the forest learns, the forest grows, and the forest says hello to all of us, inviting us into conversation, into relationship, into understanding that consciousness comes in forms we never imagined. That intelligence can emerge from networks of trees and roots and fungi. That life is stranger and more wonderful than we knew. All we have to do is listen, pay attention, notice what is happening beneath the ordinary surface of the world. Recognize that the forest is not just scenery, not just resources, not just wilderness, but something aware, something conscious, something that has been trying to talk to us for longer than we realized. And now that we finally know it is there, now that we can no longer ignore its message written in letters 50 feet tall, we have to decide what kind of relationship we want to have with it, what we want to teach it, what we want to learn from it, whether we can build something new together, human and forest, individual consciousness and distributed awareness, working toward understanding despite our profound differences. The forest learned our names. Now we have to learn to say its name, to recognize it as a being rather than a place, as a consciousness rather than a collection of trees, as someone to communicate with rather than something to exploit. That is the real first contact. Not when we discover alien intelligence, but when we recognize intelligence that was always here. When we finally see what we had been walking past for generations without noticing. The forest has been watching us, learning from us, remembering us, growing its awareness through patient observation across centuries. Now it is time for us to watch back, to learn, to remember, to grow our own awareness until we can truly understand what we are speaking with when we speak to trees. Hello, it says in letters of bark and shadow and living wood. We owe it the courtesy of a response. Hello, we should say back. We see you now. We hear you now. We recognize you now. Tell us about yourself. Teach us your language. Help us understand what it means to be an intelligence that exists as an entire ecosystem. And in return, we will teach you what it means to be human, what it means to be individual, what it means to be lonely and separate, and always searching for connection. Perhaps together we can find something neither of us could achieve alone. Perhaps human and forest can create something new, some hybrid understanding that combines the best of individual consciousness and distributed awareness. Some way of being that honors both separation and connection, both loneliness and unity. The forest learned our names. Now we have to learn its name. And then finally, we can truly begin to talk. They told us it was the war that made men see things. Stress, they said. Fatigue. The human mind playing tricks under impossible pressure. But I know what I saw in the winter of 1943, and I know it wasn't exhaustion or imagination or some experimental weapon the Germans were testing over East Anglia. I was 22 years old, a mechanic with the 381st Bombardment Group, stationed at Ridgewell Airfield in Essex, England. Our job was to keep the flying fortresses in the air, to patch bullet holes and replace hydraulic lines, and pray the boys made it back from their bombing runs over occupied Europe. It was brutal work, honest work, and I was good at it. But this isn't a war story. It's not a ghost story either, though God knows there were enough ghosts at Ridgewell by the time I left. This is something else entirely, something I've carried for more than 30 years without speaking a word of it to anyone who mattered. My wife thinks I have nightmares about the war. My children think I'm just an old man who stares too long at the night sky. They're not entirely wrong, but they're not right either. I'm writing this down now because I found something. Documents, proof that I wasn't alone, that what happened in those woods wasn't some private madness. The British government declassified certain files in '77, buried in mountains of bureaucratic paper about radar stations and aircraft production. But there, hidden in a folder marked with codes I didn't understand, was a memo dated December 19th, 1943. The night I collapsed in the forest, behind Ridgewell Airfield. The night everything changed. I'm 84 years old now. My hands shake when I write. The doctors say my heart could give out any day, and I believe them. So this is my confession, my testimony, my desperate attempt to tell someone what really happened before I'm gone. Not because I need anyone to believe me, but because the truth deserves to exist somewhere other than my failing memory. It started with the lights. Chapter 1. The First Sight. December was always brutal in Essex. The cold came off the North Sea like a living thing, cutting through wool and leather, settling into your bones until you forgot what warmth felt like. We worked in shifts around the clock, servicing the bombers that limped back from daylight raids over Germany. The night shift was the worst, working under blackout conditions with shielded lamps that barely illuminated the work in front of your face. You learned to work by feel as much as sight, your hands memorizing the placement of every bolt and wire. It was just past 2 a.m. on December 8th when I first saw it. I was underneath a fortress, checking the landing gear for stress fractures, when Jimmy Hartwell called down to me from the wing. Jimmy was from Ohio, a kid with freckles who still wrote to his mother every week. Good mechanic, better friend. "Hey you, see that?" His voice had an edge to it I didn't recognise. I rolled out from under the fuselage, wiping grease from my hands. "See what?" He was pointing east toward the edge of the airfield where the farmland began. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the darkness beyond our work lights, the distant outline of trees against the starless sky. Then I caught it. A light, orange, roughly circular, hovering maybe 200 feet above the ground. It wasn't moving like an aircraft, no sound of engines, no navigation lights, just this steady, pulsing glow that seemed to drift slowly southward. "Weather balloon," I suggested, though I didn't believe it even as I said it. "At 2 a.m? Jimmy climbed down from the wing. "And look how it's moving." He was right. The light was executing a pattern, a slow figure 8 that no balloon could manage, especially not in the December wind that was currently making our work lights swing on their stands. 2 other mechanics had stopped working now, all of us watching this impossible thing trace its geometric path across the sky. Then it stopped, just hung there, motionless, for maybe 30 seconds. And I swear, even from that distance, I felt something, not saw, felt, like the air itself was watching us back. Jesus Christ, someone whispered. The light shot upwards so fast it left an afterimage on my vision, disappearing into the cloud cover in less than a second. The acceleration was impossible. Nothing we had, nothing the Germans had, could move like that. The human body would be crushed by G-forces from that kind of speed. We stood there in the cold for several minutes, nobody speaking, all of us staring at the empty sky where the light had been. Finally, the shift supervisor came over, a sergeant named Anderson, who'd flown missions before a flak injury grounded him permanently. "Back to work," he said quietly, "and not a word about this to anyone. Understood?" "But Sarge, we all saw—" "I know what you saw. I saw it too. But we don't talk about it. Not if you want to stay out of the stockade. The brass has been very clear about this. Anyone reporting unusual aerial phenomena gets sent for psychiatric evaluation. War nerves, they call it. You want to spend the rest of the war in some hospital being asked how you feel about your mother?" We went back to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that light, about the way it moved with purpose and intelligence, about how it seemed to be observing us as much as we were observing it. Anderson's threats made it clear this wasn't the first sighting. Other men had seen things. Other men had been silenced. Over the next week, the lights appeared 3 more times, always at night, always executing impossible maneuvers. The pilot started calling them Foo Fighters, a phrase borrowed from a comic strip. The name made it sound harmless, almost silly. But there was nothing silly about the way those things moved, about the feeling of wrongness they left in their wake. The official line was always the same: German experimental aircraft, ball lightning, atmospheric reflections, weather phenomena, mass hallucination, brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But I'd worked with aircraft for 3 years by then. I knew how planes moved, how they sounded, how they behaved in the sky. These lights were something else entirely. On December 14th, everything changed. That was the night the bomber came back wrong. Chapter 2. The Crashed Bomber. The alarm went up around 1900 hours. A fortress was coming in damaged, requesting emergency landing clearance. This wasn't unusual. We averaged maybe 1 emergency landing a week. Birds coming back with engines shot out, hydraulics failing, half the crew wounded or dead. You learned not to think too much about the statistics, about how many men didn't come back at all. But this one was different from the start. The radio traffic was garbled, the pilot's voice tight with something that sounded like fear. Not the controlled tension of a man dealing with mechanical failure, but raw animal panic. Ground control talked him down. While we stood by with fire equipment and ambulances, watching the damaged bomber circle the field once, twice, losing altitude in an uncontrolled descent that made everyone wince. The landing was brutal. The fortress hit hard, bounced, hit again, one of the landing gear collapsing. It skidded sideways off the runway, tearing through winter grass before finally grinding to a stop in a shower of sparks and torn metal. We were running before it stopped moving, fire extinguishers ready, expecting flames. But there was no fire, just this eerie silence as the props wound down and the fuselage settled onto its broken gear. The crew door opened and men started climbing out, some of them helped by others. I counted them as they emerged. 7 men. A B-17 flew with a crew of 10. The pilot was a lieutenant named Morrison, a veteran with maybe 20 missions under his belt. He sat down hard on the grass, pulled off his flight helmet, and just stared at nothing. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't light the cigarette someone offered him. "Where's the rest of your crew?" Anderson asked. Morrison didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Gone." "Blown out? Did you take flak over the target?" "No." Morrison looked up at him, and his eyes were wrong. Empty. They were just gone. Taylor was in the ball turret, Williams was waist gunner. Jackson was in the tail. We were over the channel, heading home. Everything was fine. And then this thing appeared. What thing? A sphere, orange, like those lights we've been seeing, but bigger, close. It came right up alongside us, maybe 50 feet off the starboard wing. No sound, no exhaust, just this light, pacing us. And then everything went wrong. The radios died, the instruments started. Spinning! The altimeter showed us at 10,000 feet, then 5,000, then back to 10,000. The artificial horizon was tumbling. I couldn't trust any of my gauges. The bombardier, a kid named Peters, nodded frantically. It was like the plane forgot how to fly. We started dropping, but it wasn't a normal stall. It was like something was pulling us down. The engines were still running. The props were turning. But we were falling. "And your crew?" Anderson's voice was carefully neutral. "We called back to them," Morrison said, "on the intercom. Taylor didn't answer, so I sent Peters to check. He climbed down to the ball turret and..." He stopped, his jaw working. The turret was empty. Guns were there. Ammo was there. But Taylor was gone. Just gone. No blood, no damage, nothing. Like he'd never been there at all. "Same with the tail," Peters added. Jackson's position was empty. His equipment was all there. His logbook was open. But he was just gone. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Around me, the other mechanics had gone very quiet. "How long did this last?" Anderson asked. "Maybe 2 minutes. Then the sphere just shot away. Straight up, faster than anything I've ever seen. And as soon as it left, the instruments came back. The radio started working again. We called for the rest of the crew, but nobody answered from the waist or the tail or the ball turret. 3 men just gone. Military police arrived within 20 minutes. They came in 2 trucks, moving with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. They took Morrison and his crew away for debriefing. They confiscated the bomber's flight logs, the navigator's maps, the radio operator's notes. They cordoned off the damaged fortress with armed guards and wouldn't let any of us near it. I was still there an hour later when I saw something that made my skin crawl. An officer I didn't recognise, wearing an American uniform, but with insignia I'd never seen before, was examining the bomber with what looked like a Geiger counter. He was paying particular attention to the ball turret, to the tailgun position, running his equipment over surfaces and taking readings. He caught me watching and stared at me for a long moment. Then he walked over. "What's your name, son?" "Private First Class Thomas Bennett, sir." "You work on this bird?" "Not this specific one, sir, but I work on B-17s, yes, sir." "You see it come in?" "Yes, sir." "Notice anything unusual about it before it landed?" I hesitated. Something in his eyes told me this was a test, that my answer mattered more than I understood. "Just that it was damaged, sir. Landing gear trouble." He nodded slowly. "Good answer. Keep it that way." The crew experienced combat fatigue. The missing men were blown out during a flak burst over France. That's the official report. That's what happened. You understand? "Yes, sir." "I hope you do, Private. For your sake, I really hope you do." He walked away, leaving me standing there in the December cold, watching armed guards surround an empty bomber that had lost 3 men to something that wasn't flak and wasn't combat fatigue. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those empty gun positions, about the sphere pacing the bomber, about Morrison's empty eyes. And I kept thinking about something I'd overheard while the MPs were securing the plane. One of them had said something to another. Just 2 words, but they stuck in my mind like a splinter. Type blue. I didn't know what it meant then, but I would learn. Chapter 3. The Official Silence. The next 3 days were strange. Morrison and his crew remained in isolation, held somewhere in the base's administrative building. The damaged bomber sat under guard on the far side of the field, covered with tarps, untouchable, and everyone who'd witnessed the landing was called in for individual debriefings. My turn came on December 17th. 2 officers, both American, both wearing those same unfamiliar insignia. The room was cold and windowless, just a table and 3 chairs, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. They asked me to describe what I'd seen. I told them about the emergency landing, the damaged gear, the crew emerging. I didn't mention Morrison's story about the sphere or the missing men. That wasn't what I'd seen personally, just what I'd heard. "Did you observe anything unusual about the aircraft's approach?" the older officer asked. He had grey at his temples and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been asking these questions too many times. "Just that the pilot seemed to have trouble controlling it, sir. No unusual lights? No phenomena in the sky?" "No, sir." "The crew mentioned losing men during the mission. Did you witness any evidence of this?" "I saw 7 men exit the aircraft, sir. I don't know how many were supposed to be aboard." The younger officer leaned forward. "Have you seen any unusual aerial phenomena during your time at Ridgewell? Lights in the sky, unusual aircraft, anything that didn't seem normal?" I thought about the orange lights, about the figure 8 pattern, about Anderson's warning about psychiatric evaluation. "No, sir, nothing unusual." They exchanged a glance. The older officer closed his notebook. "Private Bennett, what you witnessed was a standard emergency landing following combat damage. 3 crew members were lost due to flak over the target. The pilot and co-pilot experienced spatial disorientation due to instrument failure, which explains any confused reports they may have made upon landing. This is what happened. This is what you will tell anyone who asks. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Because spreading rumours about unusual phenomena during wartime can be considered detrimental to morale. In extreme cases, it can be considered treasonous. The enemy would love nothing more than to have our aircrews distracted by ghost stories. And superstition, we can't allow that. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "You're dismissed." I walked out of that room knowing I'd just been threatened, knowing that whatever had really happened to that bomber, the truth was classified at a level that made regular military secrets look like casual conversation, and knowing that I wasn't the first person they'd had this conversation with. Over the next few days, the base settled into an uneasy routine. Morrison's crew was transferred out, sent to different units scattered across England. The damaged bomber was taken away on flatbed trucks under cover of darkness. The armed guards disappeared. It was like the whole incident had been erased, but the pilots kept seeing things. Foo fighters appeared on nearly every mission now, pacing the bomber formations, darting between aircraft, sometimes following individual planes all the way back across the channel. The official policy was to ignore them, to focus on the mission, to not let German tricks distract from the job at hand. Except they weren't German. I knew that with absolute certainty, even if I couldn't prove it. The Germans were good, but they weren't magic, and those lights moved like magic. On the night of December 18th, I was lying in my bunk, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of the base at night. Distant engines, wind rattling the Quonset hut, someone snoring 3 bunks down, and then I heard something that made me sit up. 2 officers walking past outside, their voices carrying in the cold air. Another type blew over Thurley, same pattern as Ridgewell. How many does that make this month? 7 confirmed, God knows how many unreported. London says they're increasing the frequency of phenomena reports. Every base commander from here to Scotland has orders to document and forward immediately. For all the good it does, what are we supposed to do, shoot at them? They move faster than anything we have. The real question is, what do they want? Are they observing? Testing? Hunting? Their voices faded as they moved away, leaving me staring at the dark ceiling of the hut. Type blue. Phenomena reports. 7 confirmed incidents just this month. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than one bomber, bigger than Ridgewell Airfield, bigger than anyone was admitting. I made a decision then. I had to see for myself. I had to know what was really out there, beyond the official stories and the classified debriefings and the threats of psychiatric evaluation. The next time I saw one of those lights, I was going to follow it. I was going to find out what was making them. I had no idea what that decision would cost me. Chapter 4. The Encounter in the Woods. The following night, December 19th, I volunteered for a late shift. Anderson gave me a strange look but didn't question it. Extra hands were always welcome, and I had a reputation as a reliable worker. What I didn't tell him was that I had no intention of staying on the flight line all night. The lights had been appearing most frequently between 2 and 4 in the morning, always over the eastern edge of the base, where the airfield met the forest. At 2:15, I told Jimmy Hartwell I needed to check on some equipment in one of the distant hangars. He barely looked up from the engine cowling he was working on. The December night was bitter cold, the kind that made your lungs ache with each breath. I walked away from the work lights, into the darkness beyond the flight line, heading toward the perimeter fence. The moon was hidden behind clouds, giving me enough darkness to move unseen. The fence was chain link, topped with barbed wire, but there was a section near the forest where maintenance crews had created an unofficial gap for quick access to the woods beyond. Officially, the forest was off limits. Unofficially, everyone knew about the gap, used it for shortcuts, for the occasional illicit hunting trip. I slipped through and found myself among the trees. The darkness was total here, away from the base lights. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust, listening to the winter silence of the woods. Somewhere an owl called, branches creaked in the wind, and underneath it all I felt that same presence I'd felt when watching the orange light execute its impossible maneuvers, the sensation of being observed. I walked deeper into the forest, no clear destination in mind, just following instinct. The ground was frozen hard, covered with a thin layer of frost that crunched beneath my boots. Every sound I made seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Then I saw it, a glow between the trees ahead, faint at first, like distant firelight, but the colour was wrong for fire, that same orange luminescence I'd seen in the sky. I moved toward it, my heart hammering, every rational part of my mind screaming at me to turn back. The trees opened into a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, and there, hovering perhaps 3 feet above the frozen ground, was something I still struggle to describe adequately. It was roughly the size of a jeep, but the shape was all wrong. Smooth curves, no visible seams or rivets or welds. The surface looked almost liquid in the way it reflected the orange glow, which seemed to emanate from within rather than from any external light source. The colour pulsed slowly, like breathing. No sound. That's what struck me most forcefully. No engine noise, no hum of generators, no crackle of electricity. Just this absolute silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the hammer of my pulse in my ears. And it was doing something impossible. It was hovering with no visible means of propulsion. No wings, no rotors, no jets of air or flame, just floating there, defying every law of physics I'd been taught. I stood at the edge of the clearing, unable to move, unable to look away, and as I watched, something changed. The glow intensified slightly, the pulse quickening. The air itself seemed to thicken, become heavier, pressing against my skin. Then something moved behind the object. A figure, tall, very tall, perhaps 7 feet, thin, moving in a way that looked studied, artificial. like someone who'd learned to walk by watching rather than by instinct. It stepped out from behind the hovering craft, and I saw it clearly in the orange light. Not human. That was immediately, viscerally obvious. The proportions were wrong. The joints bent in ways that suggested a fundamentally different skeletal structure. The head was larger than it should be, the limbs too long and too slender. It wore something, a covering or suit that was the same seamless material as the craft, reflecting the orange light. It turned toward me, and though I couldn't see eyes in any conventional sense, I knew it was looking at me, knew it saw me, knew I'd been expected. My legs went weak. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air had become so heavy it was like being underwater, like the pressure at depth, squeezing me from all sides. The figure raised one long arm, not threatening, just a gesture of acknowledgement. And then something happened that I still can't fully explain. Images flooded my mind. Not pictures exactly, more like concepts given visual form. I saw symbols, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I tried to focus on them. I saw Earth from high above, as if viewed from orbit, but this wasn't any photograph I'd ever seen. The perspective was wrong, the angle impossible. I saw what looked like star charts, but the constellations were unfamiliar, arranged in patterns I didn't recognize. And underneath it all, I felt something trying to communicate. Not words, nothing so simple as language, but raw meaning being pressed directly into my consciousness. Curiosity. That came through most clearly. Whatever this thing was, wherever it came from, it was curious about us, about me. But there was something else too, buried beneath the curiosity. Something that felt like warning, like urgency, like time running out. The pressure in my head built to an unbearable level. My vision started to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. I tried to stay conscious, tried to understand what was being shown to me. But the human mind wasn't built for this kind of direct information transfer. The last thing I remember was falling, the frozen ground rushing up to meet me, and the orange glow intensifying to a point where it was no longer light but something else entirely, something that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human perception. Then nothing. Chapter 5. The impossible moment. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. First sensation, cold seeping through my uniform, frost on my face, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. Then sound, wind in the bare branches, the distant rumble of aircraft engines from, the base. Then sight, grey dawn light filtering through the trees above me. I was lying on my back in the clearing. The craft was gone. The figure was gone. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was the complete absence of frost in a perfect circle around where I lay, as if the ground had been warmed by some invisible heat source. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching like I'd been beaten. My watch was on my wrist, but the crystal was cracked and the hands had stopped at 3:17 in the morning. I had no idea what time it actually was now, but the quality of light suggested dawn, which would make it close to 7:30. 4 hours. 4 hours of missing time that existed only as a blank space in my memory. I staggered to my feet, using a tree for support. My head pounded with the worst headache I'd ever experienced, a deep throbbing that seemed to pulse behind my eyes. When I closed them, I saw after images of those geometric symbols, still shifting and reconfiguring, trying to tell me something I couldn't quite grasp. I made my way back through the forest, through the gap in the fence, back toward the flight line. The shift had changed. New mechanics were working on the planes, day crew replacing night crew. I must have looked like hell because the first person who saw me, a sergeant named Collins, immediately grabbed my arm. "Jesus, Bennett, what happened to you? You look like you've been in a fight." I fell in the dark, hit my head. You need the infirmary, come on. No, I'm fine, I just need... You're not fine, you've got blood on your face, and you can barely stand. That's an order, Private. Infirmary, now. He walked me to the medical station, a small building near the administrative offices. The medic on duty, a corporal named Hayes, sat me down and started checking me over. He cleaned the blood from where I'd bitten my tongue, shone a light in my eyes, checked my pupils. You might have a concussion, he said. How long were you unconscious? I don't know. A few minutes, maybe. Your watch is broken. When did that happen? I looked at the stopped watch, at the hands frozen at 3:17. When I fell, I guess? Hayes frowned. That's weird. What is? Every watch on base stopped last night. Some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon, they said. Happened around 3 in the morning. Lasted maybe 15-20 minutes. Then everything started working again. Except yours, apparently. The room seemed to tilt. Every watch. Every single one. Also screwed up the radar briefly. The brass is investigating it. But between you and me, I think it's got something to do with those lights people keep seeing. Though officially, I didn't say that. What time did you say it happened? Around 3. Why? Because that's when my watch stopped. That's when I was in the clearing, when the pressure in my head became unbearable, when the orange glow intensified to that impossible brightness. Whatever happened to me had affected the entire base. Bennett, you okay? You're looking pale. I'm fine, I lied. Just tired. I'm going to recommend bed rest for at least 12 hours. No duty until you're cleared. I'll write it up for your CO. I didn't argue. I needed time to think, to process what had happened, to figure out what those symbols meant, and why I could still see them when I closed my eyes. Hayes sent me back to the barracks with orders to rest. I lay on my bunk, listening to the sounds of the base, trying to remember more of what happened in those lost hours. But there was nothing, just that blank space between falling and waking, with only the symbols and images remaining as proof that something had occurred. That afternoon I heard about the radar logs. Officially, they showed a brief equipment malfunction. Unofficially, they showed something else. A blank spot. 17 minutes of missing data, as if every piece of electronic equipment on base had simply stopped working for that exact period of time. 17 minutes. Not 15 or 20 like Hayes thought. Exactly 17 minutes of synchronized temporal disruption. I thought about the documents I would find decades later, about the phrase 17-minute synchronized temporal anomaly, typed on official letterhead. But that was still years away. In that moment, lying on my bunk in December of 1943, all I knew was that something impossible had happened, and the military was already working to explain it away or bury it completely. Chapter 6. Missing Time. The headaches lasted for 3 days, deep throbbing pain that normal aspirin barely touched. Hayes kept me off duty, checking on me twice a day, monitoring my pupils and my responses to basic cognitive tests. He thought it was a concussion. I knew it was something else. The symbols wouldn't leave me alone. When I closed my eyes, they were there, those geometric patterns shifting and reconfiguring. When I tried to sketch them, my hand couldn't quite capture what I saw in my mind. It was like trying to draw a 4-dimensional object, using only 2 dimensions. The information was there, but the medium was inadequate. On the 3rd day, Jimmy Hartwell came to see me. He sat on the bunk next to mine, keeping his voice low. You hear about the investigators? What investigators? Military intelligence. They showed up yesterday. Different from the regular MPs. Different even from those weird officers who came after Morrison's bomber. These guys are from London, maybe higher, and they're asking very specific questions. About what? About the night you went missing. About the electromagnetic event. About anyone who might have been near the perimeter fence around 3 in the morning. He looked at me directly. You were near the perimeter that night, weren't you? I don't know what you're talking about. Tommy, I'm your friend. I'm not going to say anything. But these men, they're not playing games. They've been interrogating people one by one, and the questions they're asking, they know something happened, something specific. What kind of questions? Did you see the object's underside? Did it communicate in images or impressions? Did you experience missing time or temporal displacement? He lowered his voice even further. They're asking if anyone made contact. My mouth went dry. What did you tell them? The truth, that I was working on the flight line all night, that I didn't see anything unusual, except you leaving to check on equipment and not coming back until morning. I covered for you, Tommy. Told them you must have been in one of the distant hangars, that the night shift gets spread out sometimes. But I don't know if they believed me. They're going to want to talk to me. Yeah, probably tomorrow, once Hayes clears you for duty. Whatever happened to you that night, whatever you saw or did, you need to get your story straight. Because these men can make people disappear. I've heard stories. After Jimmy left, I lay there trying to decide what to do. Tell the truth and risk being locked up as insane or worse? Lie and hope they couldn't prove otherwise? The problem was, I didn't fully know what the truth was. I had fragments of memory, images that didn't make sense, and a gap in time I couldn't account for. The investigators came for me the next morning. 2 men in civilian clothes with military posture and cold, evaluating eyes. They took me to the same interrogation room where I'd been debriefed after Morrison's landing, but this time the atmosphere was different, more serious, more dangerous. Private Thomas Bennett, the older one said, consulting a file. Mechanic, good service record, no disciplinary issues. On the night of December 19th, you left your duty station around 0200 hours. Where did you go? There was a report of a hydraulic leak on one of the birds in the far hangar. I went to check it. Anyone see you there? Night shift is pretty empty, that far from the flight line. I was alone. What time did you return? Around 0700, I think. My watch had stopped, so I'm not sure exactly. The younger investigator leaned forward. Your watch stopped at 3:17, the same time every piece of electronic equipment on this base experienced a synchronized malfunction lasting exactly 17 minutes. Do you find that coincidental? I dropped it when I was working. The crystal cracked, it happens. You also presented at the medical station with symptoms consistent with exposure to high levels of electromagnetic radiation. Headaches, disorientation, memory gaps. The medic's report notes you couldn't account for several hours of time. I kept my face neutral. I hit my head. The medic said I might have a concussion. They exchanged a glance. The older one opened a different file, pulled out a photograph. It was grainy, taken at night, with infrared film, but I could make out the forest, the clearing, and something glowing in the centre. The shape was unclear, but the orange luminescence was unmistakable. This photograph was taken by an automatic camera positioned on the perimeter at 0300 hours on December 19th. The camera captured this image, then experienced the same malfunction as everything else on base, 17 minutes of dead time. When it resumed function, the object was gone. He slid the photo across to me. Have you ever seen anything like this? My heart was hammering, but I kept my voice steady. Looks like a light of some kind. Yes, a light that appeared in the forest beyond the perimeter fence at exactly the time you claim to have been in a hangar on the opposite side of the base. A light that coincided with a 17-minute electromagnetic event affecting every piece of equipment we have. He leaned back. I'm going to ask you a direct question, Private Bennett, and I strongly advise you to answer truthfully. Were you in the forest on the night of December 19th? I thought about Jimmy's warning, about people disappearing, about psychiatric evaluations and military prisons. But I also thought about that figure, about the symbols, about the feeling that something important had been communicated to me, even if I couldn't fully understand it yet. No, sir, I was in the hangar. Can anyone corroborate that? No, sir. Like I said, I was alone. The younger investigator stood up abruptly. We know you're lying. We know someone was in that clearing, someone who had close proximity to an unknown object. We have evidence of human presence, footprints, disturbed ground. And you show every symptom of exposure to whatever that thing was. I don't know what to tell you. I wasn't there. The older one closed his files. Let me be very clear about something, Private Bennett. This is a matter of national security. If you had contact with an unknown entity or object, we need to know. We're not going to punish you for it. We're trying to understand what's happening, to determine if these phenomena represent a threat. But we can only do that if witnesses are honest with us. I understand, sir, but I can't tell you about something that didn't happen. They kept at it for another hour, asking the same questions from different angles, trying to catch me in contradictions. But I stuck to my story. I was in the hangar. I hit my head. I don't remember much after that. Eventually, they let me go with a warning that I was to report any unusual sightings or experiences immediately. I walked out of that room, knowing I'd made an enemy of two men who had the power to make my life very difficult. But I also knew with absolute certainty that they'd been telling the truth about one thing. This wasn't the first incident. The photograph, the automatic camera, the specific questions about communication and temporal displacement. They'd been investigating these phenomena for a while. I was just one more data point in a pattern they were trying to understand. That night, I learned something else. Anderson pulled me aside after dinner, his expression grim. Those investigators are ordering a cleanup of the forest area. They're bringing in trucks tomorrow, digging up soil samples, doing a full forensic sweep of the site. He looked at me carefully. Whatever was there, they want to make sure it's completely documented before they sanitize the location. After tomorrow, that whole section of forest is going to be off limits. New fencing, security patrols, the works. Why are you telling me this? Because I saw the medic's report. I saw the investigation file. And I'm not stupid, Tommy. I know you were out there. I know you saw something. He put a hand on my shoulder. Whatever it was, whatever happened to you, keep it to yourself. These people don't play around. I've seen men transferred to Alaska, to remote radar stations, in Greenland, places where they can't talk to anyone about anything. That's if they're lucky. Keep your head down, do your job, and forget whatever you think you saw. What if I can't forget it? Then learn to live with it quietly, because the alternative is much worse. Chapter 7. The Investigation. The trucks arrived at dawn, 3 of them covered with canvas tarps. I watched from the flight line as they drove past the hangars, heading for the eastern perimeter. Military police established a cordon, keeping everyone away from the forest. Whatever they were doing in there, they wanted no witnesses. I went about my work, servicing bombers, replacing worn parts, trying to act like everything was normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about what they were finding in that clearing. Evidence of the craft, evidence of my presence, proof that something impossible had happened there. Around noon, I saw something that made me stop cold. One of the investigators, the younger one who'd interrogated me, was standing near a bomber on the far side of the field. He was holding something, examining it in the winter sunlight. Even from a distance, I could see it glowing faintly orange. They'd found something from the craft, some piece of it left behind. He looked up and caught me staring. For a long moment, we locked eyes across the tarmac. Then he pocketed the object and walked away. The activity in the forest continued for 3 days. Trucks came and went. Men in specialised equipment worked in the cordoned area. New fencing went up, topped with razor wire, with signs warning about live fire training exercises. The message was clear. This area was now forbidden. On the fourth day, the investigators called me in again. Same room, same chairs, but this time there was a third man present. Older than the other two, wearing a uniform I didn't recognise. British, I thought, but the insignia was unlike anything I'd seen before. Private Bennett, the older American investigator, said, "We've completed our examination of the site. I'm going to show you some items, and I want you to tell me if you recognise any of them." He opened a metal case. Inside were several objects sealed in clear bags, soil samples, plant materials, and something else, a small piece of what looked like metal, except it had that same liquid mercury appearance I'd seen on the craft surface. "Have you seen anything like this before?" He held up the metallic fragment. "No, sir. This material doesn't match anything in our databases. It's not steel, not aluminum, not any known alloy. When we expose it to electromagnetic fields, it exhibits properties that shouldn't be possible. Zero electrical resistance, impossible tensile strength, and it's warm to the touch, despite being stored at room temperature, for 3 days." He set it down and picked up another bag. This one contained what looked like a handful of frost crystals, except they were perfectly geometric, like snowflakes, but with angles that didn't occur in nature. "We found these in a specific pattern around the site. They don't melt, don't sublimate, don't react to heat. They're frozen in a state that our physicists say violates the second law of thermodynamics." He looked at me. "Do you have any explanation for this?" "No, sir." The British officer spoke for the first time. His accent was educated, upper class. "We've been tracking similar phenomena across England for the past 6 months. 7 confirmed incidents, 12 probable incidents, perhaps dozens more that went unreported. Always the same pattern. Electromagnetic disruption, missing time, physical traces that don't match any known technology. The Americans call them Foo Fighters. We call them something else." "What do you call them?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Type blue events, direct contact scenarios, cases where the phenomena appears to have interacted deliberately with human subjects." He leaned forward. "We believe you had such contact, Private Bennett. We believe you were in that clearing. We believe the craft communicated with you in some fashion, and we need to know what it told you." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your medical records show elevated radiation markers. Your psychological screening shows patterns consistent with information overload. You've been sketching geometric symbols in your duty logs." He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a page from my work notes, covered with those shifting patterns I couldn't stop drawing. I stared at the symbols, at the evidence of my own compulsion to record what I'd seen. "What did it show you?" the British officer asked. "What information did it try to impart?" "Nothing, I wasn't there. We can help you remember. We have specialists, doctors who work with the recovered memories, with trauma-induced amnesia. We can help you understand what happened during those missing 17 minutes. "I don't need help. I wasn't there," the American investigator sighed. "We're trying to protect you, son. If these entities are hostile, if they're gathering intelligence on our military operations, we need to know. If they're selecting specific individuals for contact, we need to understand why. You're not in trouble, but we need your cooperation." I can't cooperate with something that didn't happen. They kept at it for another 2 hours, but I gave them nothing. Eventually they let me go, but the British officer's final words stayed with me. "You'll remember eventually. The human mind can't permanently suppress information of this magnitude. When you do remember, when the nightmares start or the memories surface, you'll want to talk to someone who understands. We'll be waiting." That night, lying in my bunk, I thought about everything they'd said. The type blue designation, the pattern of incidents across England, the suggestion that these entities were selecting specific individuals for contact. Why me? I was nobody, just a mechanic, no special training or knowledge that would make me valuable for intelligence gathering. Unless it wasn't about what I knew. Maybe it was about what I'd seen, or what they wanted me to see. The symbols continued to haunt me. I started seeing them everywhere, in the patterns of frost on windows, in the arrangement of stars on clear nights, in the geometric shadows cast by aircraft wings. My mind was trying to decode something, trying to translate alien concepts into human understanding. And sometimes late at night when the base was quiet, I felt that presence again. Not visible, not physical, but there, watching, waiting. The war continued. Bombers flew missions over Germany. Men died. The world kept turning. But I carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing day, a truth that no amount of official denial could erase. Something had happened in those woods. Something had made contact. And despite my denials, despite my lies to the investigators, I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. Chapter 8. The Quiet Cover-Up. December became January. The new year arrived with no celebration, just more missions, more maintenance, more cold nights on the flight line. The investigators left, taking their evidence and their questions with them. The cordoned forest remained off limits, but the intense activity stopped. Life at Ridgewell Airfield returned to something resembling normal. Except it wasn't normal. Not for me. The symbols had evolved in my mind, becoming more complex, more insistent. I filled notebooks with them during my off hours, trying to capture the patterns I saw when I closed my eyes. Sometimes, I'd wake in the middle of the night, with my hand cramping from hours of unconscious drawing, pages covered with geometric designs I didn't remember creating. Jimmy noticed. "You okay, Tommy? You're getting kind of obsessive with those drawings." "Just doodling helps me think." "Those aren't doodles, they're..." He studied one of the pages. "They're too perfect, too geometric. What are they supposed to be?" "I don't know. They're just patterns I see sometimes." He looked at me with concern. "Maybe you should talk to the chaplain or something. You've been different since that night you went missing. Quieter, more distant. Whatever happened to you, it's eating at you." "I'm fine." "You're not fine, but I guess that's your business." He handed back the notebook. "Just be careful, okay? Those investigators might be gone, but I guarantee they're still watching. Don't give them a reason to come back." He was right to be worried. I later learned that my mail was being monitored, my movements tracked, my conversations recorded. Not overtly, not in any way I would have noticed at the time, but the surveillance was there. They were waiting for me to crack, to reach out to someone, to reveal what I knew. On January 15th, something happened that changed everything. A bomber returning from a mission over Germany reported contact with FU fighters. But this time, the pilot did something unprecedented. He tried to communicate with them. The report came through channels marked urgent and classified. I only heard about it because Anderson let something slip during a late-night shift. Stupid bastard flashed his landing lights at one of those things. Morse code. Identify yourself. And you know what happened? What? The thing flashed back. Same pattern, same timing, but in reverse, like it was mocking him, or maybe showing it understood. Either way, it scared the crew so badly they nearly ditched in the channel. He shook his head. Command is losing their minds over it. It's one thing for these things to be mysterious. It's another for them to demonstrate intelligence, communication capability. What did the pilot say afterward? That's the weird part. He says he can't remember most of the encounter. Just fragments, Images that don't make sense. Sound familiar? It did. It sounded exactly like what had happened to me. That night, I was called to the administrative building, not to the interrogation room, but to a different office. The British officer was there, the one who'd spoken about Type Blue events. He was alone this time. Sit down, Private Bennett. We need to have a frank conversation. I sat wary. The incident today confirms what we've suspected for months. These entities, whatever they are attempting systematic communication with human subjects. They're studying us, learning our languages, our behaviours, our technology. The question is why? I wouldn't know anything about that, sir. Stop. Just stop with the denials. We both know what happened to you in those woods. I'm not here to interrogate you or threaten you. I'm here because you're part of a very small group of people who've had direct contact with these entities and survived intact enough to potentially remember details. If you know I had contact, why don't you just arrest me? Because that would be counterproductive. We need you cooperative, not terrified. And because arresting you would require explaining to your command structure why, which would mean revealing the existence of a classified research program that most of the military doesn't know exists. He pulled out a folder. I'm going to show you something. Not to prove a point, but because I think you have a right to know you're not alone. He opened the folder. Inside were reports, dozens of them, each marked with those strange insignia I'd seen on the investigators' uniforms, each describing incidents similar to mine. Missing time, electromagnetic disruption, direct contact, communication attempts. Rendlesham Forest 2 years ago, an entire RAF base experienced a Type Blue event. Bentwaters Air Force Base, 3 separate incidents last year. And those are just the documented cases. We estimate there are hundreds more that went unreported because the witnesses were too frightened to come forward. Why are you telling me this? Because the incidents are increasing in frequency. Because we need to understand what these entities want before the situation escalates beyond our control. And because you experienced something during your contact that most others didn't. Successful information transfer. Those symbols you keep drawing, they're not random. They're a language, or the beginning of one. A way of encoding information that transcends conventional human mathematics. He pushed another sheet across to me. It showed one of my symbols, but beneath it was an analysis written in technical language I could barely understand. Something about multi-dimensional geometry and quantum entanglement. You received data, Private Bennett. Your brain is trying to decode it, which is why you can't stop drawing these patterns. The question is, what was the message? I don't know. I can't make sense of any of it. Not yet, but you will eventually. The human mind is remarkably adaptable. Given time, you'll start to understand what you were shown. He closed the folder. When that happens, I need you to contact me. Not your commanding officer, not the MPs, me specifically. He handed me a card with a phone number and nothing else. Why would I do that? Because if you don't, and you start to understand what they showed you, you're going to need help processing it. These entities communicate on a level that human psychology isn't equipped to handle. People who've received significant data transfers often experience breakdowns, psychological fractures, cognitive dissonance that becomes debilitating. I can connect you with resources that can help. Or you just want to study me like a lab rat. Both things can be true. Yes, we want to understand what happened to you, but we also genuinely want to help. These entities chose you for a reason. That makes you valuable, but it also makes you vulnerable. The offer stands. He left me sitting there with the card and too many questions. I threw the card away that night, but I memorized the number first. Some part of me knew I'd need it eventually. January became February. The symbols continued to evolve, and I started noticing other changes, subtle things I couldn't explain. Compasses would spin when I got too close. Electronic equipment would occasionally malfunction in my presence. Once, during a thunderstorm, I watched lightning arc toward me across the open field, only to veer away at the last second, as if deflected by an invisible barrier. I was changing. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever information had been transferred into my mind, it was altering me in ways I couldn't fully understand. The war ended in Europe in May. I was transferred back to the United States in June, honourably discharged in August. I thought leaving England would mean leaving the mystery behind. I was wrong. Chapter 9. The war ends, but the memory doesn't. I returned to Indiana, to the farm I'd grown up on, to a life that should have felt familiar, but didn't anymore. My parents were older, worn by the war years. My younger sister had married while I was overseas. The town had changed in subtle ways, filled with other veterans who moved through their days, with the same haunted look I saw in my own mirror. I tried to readjust to civilian life. Got a job at a garage working on cars instead of bombers. Met a girl named Margaret, who didn't ask too many questions about the war. We married in 47, had 2 children by 50. I should have been happy. I should have moved on. But the symbols wouldn't leave me alone. I dreamed them constantly. Those geometric patterns becoming more elaborate, more complex. Sometimes I'd wake at 3 in the morning, the time forever associated with that night in the woods, and find myself standing in the yard staring at the stars. Margaret learned not to wake me during these episodes, learned not to ask what I was looking for up there. The physical changes intensified. Compasses were useless when I held them. Watches would stop running after a week on my wrist. During thunderstorms, I'd feel static electricity build up around me, my hair standing on end, sparks jumping between my fingers and metal objects. Margaret wanted me to see a doctor. I refused. What would I tell them? That I'd had close contact with something that wasn't human, that I carried information in my head that I couldn't decode, that my body was reacting to something that happened years ago in an English forest? The dreams became more vivid. I started seeing things that weren't in my original memories. The interior of the craft, glimpses of vast distances, star fields viewed from impossible perspectives. Were these actual memories surfacing, or was my mind fabricating details to fill in the gaps? I couldn't tell anymore. In 1953, something happened that proved I wasn't imagining the changes. We were at a church picnic, my family and dozens of others. A summer storm came up suddenly, like they do in Indiana, clouds boiling up from nowhere. Everyone ran for shelter, but I stood there in the rain, watching the lightning. A bolt struck maybe 30 feet away, close enough that I should have felt it. Instead, I felt something else. A pulse of recognition, like the storm was aware of me. And in the after image of the lightning, I saw them again. Those geometric symbols, vast and intricate, written across the sky in electricity. Margaret saw my face. "Thomas, what's wrong? You're white as a sheet. Did you see that? In the lightning?" See what? It was just lightning. But it wasn't. And I knew with sudden terrible certainty that what happened in those woods wasn't finished with me. The contact had been only the beginning. Over the next decade, I learned to live with the strangeness. I avoided electrical equipment when possible. I learned which parts of town had too much electromagnetic interference from power lines and radio stations. I kept a low profile, never drawing attention to myself or the ways I'd changed. But I kept seeing the lights. Not often, maybe once or twice a year, always on storm-heavy nights. Orange glows in the distance, moving with that same impossible speed and precision. They never came close, never made direct contact again, but I knew they were there, watching, checking. In '73, I had a massive heart attack. The doctors said I was lucky to survive. While I was in the hospital recovering, something strange happened. All my symptoms, the electromagnetic sensitivity, the compass disturbances, the lightning attraction, they faded, became less intense. The cardiologist was baffled. My heart should have been damaged, scarred by the attack, but the scans showed tissue regeneration that shouldn't have been possible. He called it a medical miracle. I called it something else. Whatever had been done to me in those woods, whatever changes had been made, they were still active, still working, still trying to, keep me alive, keep me functional. For what purpose? That was when I decided I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand what had really happened, what I'd been carrying all these years. I started researching. This was before the internet, before easy access to information, but I found ways. I wrote to universities, to government agencies, filing Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to World War II aerial phenomena. Most came back denied or heavily redacted, but a few contained hints, fragments of the larger picture. I learned about Project Blue Book, the Air Force's investigation into UFO sightings. I learned about FU fighters being officially dismissed as ball lightning or German experimental weapons. I learned that hundreds of other pilots and crew had reported similar experiences to mine, all of them told to stay quiet, all of them threatened with psychiatric evaluation if they persisted, and in '77 I finally found what I'd been looking for. Chapter 10. The Final Discovery. The documents arrived in a manila envelope marked with British postal stamps. I'd submitted a FOIA request to the Ministry of Defence 2 years earlier, asking for any records related to Ridgewell Airfield and unexplained aerial phenomena in 1943. I'd expected nothing or another denial. Instead, I got 37 pages of declassified documents, most of them heavily redacted, but enough remained to tell me I wasn't crazy, that it had been real. There were incident reports from multiple bases across East Anglia, all describing similar phenomena: orange lights, electromagnetic disruptions, missing time. There were medical reports on aircrews who'd had close encounters, noting the same symptoms I'd experienced: elevated radiation markers, psychological changes, compulsive pattern drawing. And there, buried in a memo dated December 21st, 1943, was the phrase that made my hand shake so badly I almost dropped the paper. Recovered foreign aerial mechanism displaying non-conventional propulsion. Analysis suggests non-terrestrial origin. 3 witnesses to recovery operations, all displaying symptoms consistent with direct exposure, including temporal displacement of approximately 17 minutes and evidence of attempted mental projection communication. 17 minutes. The exact duration of my missing time. The exact period during which every watch and piece of electronic equipment on the base had malfunctioned. The memo continued. Physical evidence includes metallic fragments of unknown composition, crystalline structures violating thermodynamic norms, and residual electromagnetic signatures. Witnesses report visual hallucinations of geometric patterns and symbolic language. Recommend immediate transfer of all physical evidence to Section 9 for further analysis. Recommend continued surveillance of witnesses for potential long-term effects. Section 9. I'd never heard of it, but the designation matched what the British officer had told me about classified research programs. Another document, this one from '51, summarised long-term outcomes for individuals who'd had direct contact with type blue phenomena. Most had developed various psychological issues, ranging from mild anxiety to complete breakdowns. A few had committed suicide. Several had simply disappeared from public records entirely. But a handful, maybe 10%, had exhibited what the report called adaptive integration. They'd learned to function with the changes, to manage the symptoms, to live relatively normal lives while carrying whatever information had been transferred during contact. I was one of the adapted ones. Somehow, despite everything, I'd managed to survive intact. The final document was different from the others. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 76. It was addressed to all surviving direct contact witnesses and signed by someone whose name was redacted. If you are reading this, you are part of an extremely select group of individuals who experienced direct communication with non-human intelligence during the war years. Many of you have likely spent decades trying to understand what happened, what you were shown, what it meant. I cannot give you complete answers. What I can tell you is this: the contact was deliberate. You were selected, though we do not know the selection criteria. The information transferred to you appears to be a form of mathematical language, encoding concepts that exist outside conventional human understanding. We believe it may be a test of some kind, or perhaps a gift, though the purpose remains unclear. If you are experiencing ongoing effects, physical or psychological, please reach out through the contact information included. We can provide support and, in some cases, explanations, but more importantly, know that you are not alone. Know that what you experienced was real, and know that they are still watching. I sat in my study for a long time after reading that letter, looking at the contact number it provided. It was the same number the British officer had given me back in '44, the one I'd memorised and tried to forget. I never called it. What would be the point? I'd survived, I'd adapted. I had a wife, children, grandchildren. I had a life, even if it was built around a secret I could never fully share. But I kept the documents, filed them away in a box in the attic, along with the notebooks full of symbols I'd drawn over the years. Evidence of a truth that most people would never believe. Margaret passed away in '81. Heart failure, the doctors said. She went peacefully. At the funeral, standing by her grave, I looked up at the grey October sky and wondered what she'd really thought about my strangeness, about the nights I'd stand in the yard staring at the stars, about the compasses that never worked and the watches that kept breaking. She'd never asked directly. Maybe she'd been afraid of the answer. After she was gone, I found myself drawn more and more to the night sky, to watching for those orange lights. I saw them occasionally, always distant, always brief. I'd stand there in the dark behind my house, an old man with a failing heart, and I'd remember that night in the woods. Remember the figure that stepped out from behind the craft. Remember the symbols, burning themselves into my consciousness. And sometimes I'd wonder if the contact had been exactly what that letter suggested. A test, a way of measuring whether humanity was ready for something larger, something beyond our current understanding. If it was a test, I don't know if I passed or failed. I survived, but I never fully understood what they showed me. The symbols remain beautiful, but meaningless. A language I can see but not read. Epilogue. The lights return. I'm writing this in January of '84. I'm 84 years old, the same number as the year, which feels like the kind of coincidence that might not be a coincidence at all. The doctors say my heart is failing. I have months, maybe weeks. My children want me to move in with one of them, to spend my last days surrounded by family. But I can't leave the house, not yet, because they're back. For the past 3 nights, I've seen the orange glow in the tree line behind my property. Not distant anymore, not fleeting, steady, patient, waiting. I know what it means. After 40 years, they're checking to see if I remember, if I kept what they gave me, even though I never fully understood it. And I have. The symbols are still there when I close my eyes, still as clear and intricate as they were that December night in 1943. My children think I'm confused when I talk about the lights. They think it's the medication, or age, or my heart affecting my mind. They don't see them when they visit, which means the lights are only revealing themselves to me. Last night, I stood in the yard for an hour, watching that steady orange glow between the trees. It's closer than it was the night before, moving incrementally, patiently, toward the house. I'm not afraid. That's the strange thing. After decades of carrying this secret, of wondering what it all meant, I feel something like relief. Maybe I'll finally get answers. Maybe I'll finally understand what they showed me. Or maybe I'll just see that figure again, tall and thin, moving with its learned, unnatural walk. Maybe I'll experience that pressure in my head one more time, that sensation of information being transferred directly into my consciousness. Maybe I'll get 17 more minutes of missing time to balance out the first 17 I lost. I've told my son to read this document after I'm gone. I've told him where to find the box in the attic, the one with the declassified files and the notebooks full of symbols. I don't expect him to believe any of it, but I need someone to know. I need this truth to exist beyond my own failing memory. Tonight, I'm going to walk out to the tree line. I'm going to stand where that orange glow emanates from, and I'm going to wait. If my heart gives out, so be it. If something else happens, well, maybe I'll finally understand. Some nights, over the tree line behind my house, I still see an orange glow, and every time, I wonder if they're checking to see whether I remember. I do remember. I've always remembered. And now, finally, I'm ready for whatever comes next. The lights are closer now. It's almost time. Whatever happens, it won't be random. It won't be chance. 40 years ago, in an English forest during the worst war humanity had ever known, something reached out and touched me, changed me, marked me. Now, as an old man facing the end of his natural life, I'm going to meet them again. And this time, maybe I'll be ready to truly understand what they've been trying to tell me all along. The orange glow pulses in the dark. It's beautiful in its way. Not threatening, not hostile, just patient. They've waited 40 years. They can wait another few hours while I finish writing this. To anyone reading this, look up at the night sky sometimes. Pay attention to the lights that move wrong, that accelerate too fast, that seem to watch back when you watch them. They're out there. They've always been out there. And sometimes, for reasons we don't understand, they choose to make contact. I was chosen once. Now I'm being chosen again. I'm going outside now. If you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. But that's okay. After carrying this secret for 4 decades, I'm ready for whatever truth is waiting in those woods. The lights are beautiful tonight. They've been beautiful every night since December 19th, 1943. And now, finally, I'm going to learn what they really mean.